Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 447th episode of Constructive Criticism. I am your host Mason, and I'm joined by my co-host Abe Stein today. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing good. It's crunch time for the RC is upon us. We still got a little bit of time to process standard, so I'm not gonna get into that this week. Sorry to bait all of the listeners, but it's just been an exciting month of Magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our Patreon question this week does involve standard. So if you want to hear that, you have to listen to the whole thing. There's no way to skip ahead on podcast devices, so you're just out of luck. You're going to unfortunately have to listen to a great episode all about Modern this week. We're going to be catching you up on Modern. A lot of stuff has happened. All be one. It really sort of shook up the format with a few cards, and that sort of caused a lot of ripples in the format. And so we're going to talk about that and sort of help get you ready for the RCQ season as well. Since the next one's Pioneer, but the one after that's Modern, we're very much aware that Modern is an incredibly expensive format, and giving you some lead time with, we can't promise you the absolute best deck going into that season. But from what we've seen so far with the Modern Horizons era, a lot of decks we're going to talk about today have stuck around in some iteration, whether they're tier 1 or tier 2. So we're going to go over some of those today to help you get ready for that. But first, we wanted to talk really quickly. So Spencer's got some stuff going on this week. He's not here. However, there was this thing that happened, and we mentioned it slightly on the show a little while ago. But basically, we got some feedback on the show that was just sort of mean-spirited and bordering on harassment, if not just harassment, towards, one of the hosts of the show. And we are all about improving and wanting to do better. And if the feedback is, in the light and in the vein of trying to make the show better, even if it's like, saying something bad about the show, we don't actually mind or care. We want to hear that, we don't mind if you're like, oh yeah, this episode this week was really bad. Y'all sort of did this thing that really sort of botched it. That's great. However, making the things personal and making it called out like just really rude stuff that I'd rather not repeat that have nothing to do with the episode, that's just like bullying and harassment. And one of you left the comment the last week, and I would honestly just prefer if you stopped listening to the podcast. I don't really care that you think I know what I'm doing or whatever. I think you're sort of a bad person, and I hope that in time in calling you out here that you'll understand why saying those mean things about somebody isn't helpful and is also just sort of like mean-spirited. And I hope that in time you can do better and come back and, have a moment where you change and grow from this. But honestly, I just hope you stop listening. And if I could prevent you from listening to the episodes, I would.
Yeah, I completely echo that sentiment. I mean, I don't want to get too into what I said, but feedback that specifically, is not really actionable, is targeted, is not constructive, but really just trying to bring someone down, especially in a context of, expressing, in context that you don't like someone personally, but you seem to like the other viewpoints on the podcast personally, and that's why you're doing it. Both Mason and I, and also Spencer, all of us believe that we are putting forth the best podcast that we can together as a group of 3 every week. That's not something that changes, that's not something that we're doing to compromise for each other. No, we all think that, and we all believe that we are putting together and forth the best show we can every week when we're doing that. We are always trying to improve, and we do want that feedback, and we do appreciate the reviews that we receive because that gives us things to work on. But, the idea that, like Mason said, just because you think that any one individual's viewpoint is good or bad, all of us as a show stand by all of each other's viewpoints as being valid, and we want to present them. And so, not everything that's going to be said on the show is going to be something that, really resonates with you, or is going to be, something actionable for you, or is going to mean a lot to you. But as a show, as a podcast, we put it together for that reason. And like Mason said, if you aren't okay with that and you want to cherry pick who it is that you think is good for the podcast, you know what? That's not your job. You, in fact, get to listen to what we put together, or you don't. And there's not really that aspect of it, and targeting, any aspect of it in that way is just not acceptable. So you really shouldn't do that. You should learn to do better, like Mason said, and I hope that you do, because it's really just not okay.
Yeah. Everyone is someone's favorite, and everyone's someone's least favorite, and you can just live your life, and you want to give them feedback, it's great, and just give them actionable feedback. That is what we all want on the show, and we all sort of strive for. Things that aren't like that are just bad and not helpful. And with that, let's move on to always improving. That is the main point of the show. If you're not, improving, then you're sort of, not pushing yourself as much. And that is what we want on the show. And that is sort of how we all approach life and Magic. And Abe, I believe you went first last week, so I'll go first this week here.
Okay.
So I think Spencer was just dodging that he knew he was first up on the always improving. And he was just like, oh yeah, I've got some stuff going on. I got to go. So I see you, Spencer. My always improving from this last week was really about time management. I have been doing, the coaching thing like full-time-ish now for the last, I guess this is week 3 of it. It's hard to believe how much time has gone by. And I mentioned a little bit before about how like I've been trying to do better about all those sort of things and make sure that I spend time on myself and I don't overindulge on Magic. And this one is sort of a failing where I didn't carve out enough time for the tournament I was going to, and I didn't get to spend as much time working on Modern as I was like. And when I'm going to go to these events and do these sort of things, I need to make sure that I am spending time, even if it might mean I'm a little bit more burnt out on Magic than I would like to be, or I'm spending a little bit too much more time. I need to strike the balance a bit better, because I just didn't spend any real time on Modern outside of like getting my Patreon update happen for 4-color. So I felt like on Sunday I was good, but a lot changes between like a Sunday and a Friday, especially when like your deck goes from being a deck that people aren't talking about to like the Mana Trader series. People are talking about it a bunch. Like, like admittedly, like I knew a bunch of people there who were talking about like, oh, what do you think about 4-color now? Da 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 da. I knew people were making shifts, and I should have shifted accordingly. And so, sort of a failing on my part there to not, strike a little bit of a better balance, and that's something that I'm sure I'm gonna have to deal with for the coming months. But I'm excited to strike that balance with.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely that's a pretty constant struggle, especially. It's kind of a blurred line for you, right? When you're coaching and doing content, whatever, trying to carve out time, because it is so different doing those things. Being ready for content reasons and for coaching reasons, being on top of things in that regard, and being on top of, okay, what is it I'm playing on exactly this weekend, not what's going on in the format, so I can help someone approach in a holistic sense. It's just two different like forms of knowledge that you need to have. And it's definitely tough to prioritize that time. So, I know that you were a little bit disappointed with your performance in Charlotte. So hopefully you're able to, take that and learn that as you're kind of, navigating this big change of going full time. So, my always improving this week was actually a big, I'm going to say a big back to basics, but it's kind of an advanced basics, and I'll get into what that is. So, this weekend, the Magic that I played, because I can't play any RCQs because I'm already qualified and there's not really anything else, was that there was a sealed store championship at a local store on Sunday. And I wound up being on the outside looking in. My seal pool wasn't that great, but I went 3-2, missed on tiebreakers, how it is. But there was a match that I played where it was absolutely... I wound up winning this match, but it was absolutely defined by my ability to successfully bluff attack my opponent on like the 3rd turn of the game or the 4th turn of the game to get my opponent corrupted so that I could start to, like, my cards were actually good enough to start to stabilize. My opponent was like absolutely ahead. I was at this point where if I don't do anything, I'm definitely going to lose. And I made this bluff attack that got the Toxic in because they were like far enough ahead that maybe they could afford it. And when I came back around, like, and won that game, it made me think about how much equity I've probably been leaving on the table in not just like not bluff attacking more, but not bluffing more in general. And I think that was something that back when we did our Fearless Magic inventories, that was something where I definitely had talked about wanting to improve at it at the time, and it definitely something that had fallen by the wayside. So, thinking back to like that match, how it really valued me. There was another match I had of just like a random like booster draft where I played an entire game where I had a cancel in my hand, and it was very clear I had a cancel in my hand. And I thought to myself, if I just played the game without the cancel in my hand, this game we went Drago for like 7 turns or whatever before my opponent could 2-spell into it in a game of limited. If I just did that against that same opponent without it, like how much that would have changed. So really just trying to take more time in active space to think about where it is I can bluff my opponents and how it is I can do that, even though it's like a very, very risky maneuver. And really trying to look for more opportunities to do that, because when I sought that opportunity and I did it over the weekend, it did directly yield me being able to compete in that match compared to just losing that game. And I credit it for like winning that match period. So that's what I'm working on this week, and that's me.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. I think bluffing is the thing. You'll hear us often talk about on the podcast, talk about like, hey, stay away and avoid it. And the truth is that there should be some middle ground there, where every now and again you should pick up the Forsaken Blade to be really weird about it, and sort of like do the thing. And I find that when your deck has the ability to like do a lot of different things, so like sometimes in limited, right, like you might have the cancel, or like like the kill spell, whatever, or like a flash threat or something. Those sort of times it becomes a lot stronger than things where you can't do it. So it is really good to think about like, what can I actually sell my opponent, and what are they willing to believe. And I know that a lot of times with 4-color I leave up mana, and it's just like they have to play around Binding and Solitude and Counterspell, and it's just like Quaddle. It's just so many things to think about. It's just, it can be overwhelming, can really trip people up, So
yeah, and the reason that I'll say that we often tell listeners to like stay away from that kind of avenue of things is that when you bluff, it really does, and you're really considering a bluff, right? It's not just like, oh, I have my mana open and I didn't have anything to do with it. It's like you are giving up a very tangible opportunity to cast a spell or to like use a card in order to accomplish something in the game that might be better than like holding your card and waiting, or not using your card immediately, because you're going to give up a resource advantage in order to try to gain the opportunity your opponent respects this thing and doesn't do the thing that you can't beat even with your cards. Mm-hmm. So it's like a really, really big gambit to do. And oftentimes when you're really trying to grow and improve, it's not going to be the best thing for you to be thinking about, because you're probably going to want to focus on your technical play and just playing the board. So, it is something you want to, and that's for me, like, that's kind of where I'm realizing I need to do a little bit more of that in order to grow. I need to push myself into that zone of like, okay, I need to take on this new skill and work it into my game. But that's something where you gotta look and be like, is this the time for me to really focus on that and study it, as opposed to, thinking about the games that you're playing.
100%. That's going to do it for Always Improving this week. Before we get into our main topic of Modern, though, Abe, we do have a new sponsor on the show. So do you want to do our little ad read for them?
Yeah, so we did get a brand new sponsor. We've got a sponsor, Bosei Juice. Bosei Juice is a legendary and delicious concoction of immune-boosting ingredients. I drink it every morning before work. It's been months and months since I've gotten sick. It really does work. It's a drink to shelter all, crafted for those who endure, Mason. It's really great. You can find it in stores near you.
Yep, love it. Make sure you use code CCMTG at checkout to get 5% off your Bosei Juice for those who endure. Let's talk about Modern, though, Abe, because this is the format that does endure. It doesn't rotate. Modern Horizon sets don't count. And let's talk about what's going on in Modern, because, last time we talked about Modern on the show, I want to say was right before I had to leave for a little bit. So that's going to be like early December. We've had a new set and 3 months. A lot's changed, but a lot's the same. I think the best place to start is probably talk about Murktide Regent, which actually, won the 10K in Charlotte this past weekend with the SCG. Has consistently done well online, and is also not that different from when we last left it.
Yeah, there's a lot of things about Modern that are still definitely the same, which is awesome. I think it's really, really cool that the format has stayed in a position of there being stable, good decks. We've had like a lot of boogeymen arise over the weeks, and over the last year, like, Yorion 4-color coming out and being like, okay, this slowly took over everything, or like Lurrus before that and Death Shadow. So seeing less of that and more of like there just being cards that are so unignorably good that they're kind of defining the format. Cards like, Ragavan, Murktide Regent, still the same players that you'd be used to. But that's really kind of where I feel about the format right now, is that everything's kind of the same. You still have the same pillars now that are defining it, and it's been really stable for a while. There have been new things like Elishnorn enabling some of the old things, like Solitude decks being able to come back, and Endurance decks being able to come back, and that whole Renin 6 Omnath package, all of that coming together again under a kind of new roof than the more like 4-color control-y decks that had like Archmage's Charm and stuff. But yeah, the format is still a format kind of defined by the play patterns of certain cards like Ragavan, and the fact that Murktide deck is still at the forefront of that is really, testament to that's what the format is that it's still just about those things, but the way that people are approaching that is really kind of grown and developed over the last few months.
100%. Abe, let's have a little conversation though about Murktide for a second. So we mentioned it's the same player. We mentioned how things are sort of consistent. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on Murktide Regent are, because there are basically, I think, two schools of camps that people talk about it. Some people talk about Murktide being the best deck in Modern. It is just the de facto best. They'll admit that like maybe it's not always 100% in every matchup or whatever every weekend, but you click the button a million times or whatever, you're going to win the most tournaments playing Murktide, doing that more than any other deck. And then there are people that say, yeah, the deck's like a 40% deck and it allows for player skill, and you're able to sort of overcome people, but when you're behind, you don't really have many ways to catch up outside of slamming a Murktide off the top. So Abe, what do you think about the Murktide deck in Modern?
So I think that right now, it's hard for me to talk about the Murktide deck in Modern without also talking about the Fair Breach decks in Modern. Because I think that what's really arisen in Modern is a dynamic where the blue and red cards are so good. Unholy Heat, Bolt, Ragavan, Dragonrace Channeler, Ledger Shredder to some extent. All these cards are really, really good. And you have a lot of ways to fill your graveyard because you're casting a lot of cheap spells in order to enable some of these cards. And then there's a question of, well, what are you going to do with all of your, you have the access to playing these good delve spells or playing, a card like Underworld Breach. What is it you're doing on your top end? And I think that Murktide Regent is currently what I would say the easier targeted of the two options between playing a game plan of I'm going to play my early threats, kind of get the game to a point where it's some sort of parity. I'm going to play my Murktide Regent with counterspell backup, and this is going to be good enough. Is that, like, instead, what you could be doing is playing all the same early game, and then just overpowering with just the raw strength of that early game, again, with an Underworld Breach kind of acting like your Treasure Cruise, or sometimes being just a combo piece in the deck that plays some of the same strong early game elements. And so, I think that Murktide Regent is in kind of a tough spot right now. Just the card is, because it's still targeted in that way. It's still, it's the card that's easiest to know how to answer, right? Your deck's going to play removal, and if you're going to play removal, you're probably going to want some amount of unconditional removal or answers to a card like Murktide Regent. It's not a card that impacts the game immediately. Your opponent gets a chance to untap and interact with it before you get to use it, whereas Underworld Breach does interact with the game immediately, and they're both kind of using the graveyard. So they're operating in the same space, but I think the ways that, and if you look at Murktide, the way that people seek to answer it is by answering the Murktide Regent itself, not by really hating it on the graveyard. Even though you could try to do that, it's not necessarily effective because it's pretty easy to like end of turn some spells, make a 5/5 Murktide Regent. That's still pretty good. Whereas in Underworld Breach, you really have to target the graveyard and shut it out, and that is kind of a lot easier for them to sidestep because the rest of their cards are so good. So I think that, for me, in order to evaluate the card, I have to compare the two because it feels like Underworld Breach is really the runner-up for that slot, or maybe now currently the front runner for that spot. But I think that currently I'd say that it's kind of a little bit behind Underworld Breach.
Yeah, I am also sort of that opinion. And you and I actually hadn't talked about this. So I really wasn't sitting up. I was curious to see where we go from here. But yeah, I think the Fair Breach stuff strikes me, and just the Breach stuff strikes me as the most powerful thing going on in Modern right now. And, I was talking to some people about this, and they were like, but Murktide's so strong, it wins the game so quickly. And I think that the incentives of Fair Breach to play with the cheapest cards, one mana spells are often like the strongest things going on, especially in the current, era of Modern, and just overwhelming your opponent with hyper efficiency and then, playing a Breach to restock or just, sort of bolt them out a couple times. I think it's actually very effective in current Modern. I was talking to Zach Allen, who lost his two win-ins actually for the 20K in Modern playing Fair Breach, where he was just like, yeah, a lot of games I just played like a very, tempo-y style game plan early, got some damage across, and then just, eventually played a Breach and bolted them like twice and then attacked with a DRC or whatever, and I won. Just didn't take that much, while also still having a deck that can interact a bunch because the 1-mana cards are so strong these days. So, yeah, I am of the opinion that the blue-red interactive shells are quite good. I think I like Breach a little more than Murktide. But it's like very clearly these are good decks, and if you're listening to us and you're trying to figure out like what you want to play in Modern for like the RCQ season coming up, if you buy the Murktide cards or the Breach cards, as long as they're legal, I think they're going to always be at worst reasonable, and that is really impressive because we're talking about these sort of being on the downswing. Or the downswing is sort of like from being like a top 5-ish deck to like lower top 5, 6, or 7 areas. Like at least that's how I feel. I don't know how you feel about 8, but I feel like that's sort of the same general vibe you're giving off.
Yeah, I would say, I have a friend locally who plays a ton of Murktide, and he's been a very successful Murktide player, but he just was like, I have basically all the pieces. If I just buy some Breaches and a couple other cards, I can kind of change between the Fair Breach deck and the Murktide deck, and it's really a question of whichever one's kind of in flavor, which one's the right deck to be in. As I said, with Underworld Breach being kind of this other Murktide Regent kind of card where you're going to leverage your graveyard for your advantage, you're going to use that to pull ahead and kind of take over the game. It's just a matter of how that's playing out. So when you can identify that people are kind of hating out what the Breach deck's trying to do, but maybe Murktide Regent's a little better positioned, you do that. And when it's the other way around, you can kind of switch. That's a really, really, solid way to make sure you have a deck that's never going to be not in a position to have a chance to win the tournament. Yeah. If you're someone who's going to be playing the entire RCQ season. And I'll say, kind of just my own thing about Underworld Breach, the card, is that looking at even just the deck that won, I think it won the Modern Super over the weekend, it looks astonishingly like a Treasure Cruise deck from when Treasure Cruise first came out. It is kind of scary to me that Breach is just a card that operates in that space of just turning, and only by playing a bunch of good cards in your deck do you get to have a card that's not ever 1 mana, draw 3 cards, but is almost always, spend your whole turn doing this to have effectively drawn, 3 or 4 cards worth of value. Is like really, really potent, especially where it felt like a lot of the time, if you didn't draw Expressive Iteration, you were just kind of doomed because you needed that positive card advantage. This card giving a lot of redundancy to that and also being just this combo piece elsewhere. It's just really, really crazy to look at a blue-red deck that looks like a Treasure Cruise deck and feel like it makes sense for that, because that's, just really, really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the best deck in Modern, personally. But yeah, the Fair Breach deck is very, very strong, in my opinion. Hammer, though, still a good deck, a deck that you've played a bunch, and I've recently picked up the Mallet, as it were. I still think Hammer's a great deck, and I think that there's a lot of things going on there, and it is one of the decks that has, sort of continued to persevere through everything, and has just sort of had to adapt with the threats going on around it for its splash, but it's still just, a very good deck, and, is getting a little bit of splash hate by Titan and 4-color Rising Up, which we'll talk about in a second, but not enough that I think Hammer isn't, a playable deck by any means.
Yeah, I would be the first to, maybe I'd be the last to let you know if Hammer was not in a good spot, but
You might be the last to admit it.
I would definitely be the last to admit it to myself, but I would admit it to you. I want you, the listener, to know. I would keep playing it, but I would tell you to stop.
Yeah.
But no, I think that there's a couple of things in the metagame that have shifted that made it so that Hammer is a little worse position. I think things like 4-color, things like a little bit Rhinos because the way they're built right now, things like Titan definitely are just, they hurt your overall positioning. The way the metagame looks now is a little different than it was even like just a month ago or like 2 months ago towards the SCG in New Jersey. But you're still going to be in a good position with the cards you play against blue-red decks. That's just like a matter of fact, is that you are going to be doing similarly powerful things and making exchanges that are on the same level of efficiency as your opponents, and you have states where you like just get a hammer on something and that's better than what their deck can do and with it better than what their deck can answer. So that's still good, and your deck's still really, really powerful. So you haven't really lost a ton there, but just a couple of things have kind of changed that have made Hammer just be not in a position where it's beating all the best things people are playing. It's kind of flipping against some of them, or there's a couple more boogeymen out there that are trying to eat you. So.
Yeah, let's speak about the first boogeyman that sort of rose to prominence over the last couple of weeks with the release of All Be One, and that was Amulet Titan. It got the Microsynth Bridge, which was a land that allows you to copy an artifact by spending mana equal to the artifact's mana value. So this essentially meant, you could play this card on one, play an amulet, and then on your next turn you have 2 amulets in play. And you can sort of start going off from there. And, with the right cards, if you have a bounce land into a grazer, you might actually just have more turn 2 and a ton more turn 3 kills. And this deck, quickly rose up, burst through a lot of tournaments, crushed them really, but did run into its old natural predator of Murktide Regent, and the sort of nature of becoming more explosive and more all-in did not help that matchup. So now players are sort of, having to readjust and refigure out what's going on, along with something else we'll talk about here in a second that's really caused a thorn in their side. But Abe, do you have any sort of thoughts or opinions on the Amulet Titan deck? It was, the start of All Be One Modern, it was sort of like this was the deck everyone could not stop talking about.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, at where Modern was when All Be One came out was a very different place than it is now, partially because of the fact that there was not a lot of Amulet Titan. There was not a lot of these decks performing, but this deck getting yet another way. It feels like every time, this is just me going to gripe about being a Hammer player playing as Amulet for a second. It feels like every time I lose that deck, it's because they assemble some sort of double Amulet turn 3, and I just die before I get to do anything, so my deck doesn't play the right kind of interaction for that. Or in the post-board games, I do have some interaction, but they also just have like a bunch of Force of Vigors, and so they interact with me pretty well, and then they just play Titan and I lose. And the fact that that entered the format with even more consistency than it had before, where that made it a big problem for the format, especially with how good Underworld Breach had been, and also it kind of trying to slow down and it being a slower combo deck than Amulet was at that point. So I'll say that it did become more of a drag racy deck, and that hurts. But if you were ever a player who felt like they needed Amulet to kind of have their slower draws to beat it, that matchup has changed for you, and you should really, really reconsider your approach to it if you're having trouble with it, because it's not a matchup where you can ask for that anymore. They just have too many ways to be redundant on Amulet.
Yep. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, and I love Amulet and could talk about the whole, I think people forget that before I played 4-color, I was Amulet guy. I played Amulet all the time, but that's okay, because 4-color's back, so let's talk about 4-color, because this was the other thing that sort of developed, is players found out how strong Elesh Norn actually is. And, funny enough, Abe, against the Titan deck, maybe you need to pick up Elesh Norn for your Hammer deck, because Valakut doesn't work, Cultivator doesn't work, Titan doesn't work on ETB. The deck sort of just falls over if Elesh Norn hits the battlefield, and so it's actually given the 4-color decks a way to stabilize against them. It's also given them random hate against all of the mirrors, because in the mirrors, like, people are leaning on Leyline Binding a lot and Solitudes to answer things. So, we're not even talking about doubling any of our own stuff yet, but just in those 2 spots, it's good. And then randomly, there are a lot of decks in Modern that rely on ETBs. Like, as an anecdotal story, I played against Goblins, all their removal and, like, card advantage involved ETBing. I played Elesh Norn, and suddenly they just had to, like, naturally drawn to the combo in order to actually get me, which is like not a realistic plan against the 4-color control deck. And then the moment you ever double your ETBs, you're just going into turbo mode against them. So 4-color sort of came back in a real way, and we're seeing players really experiment and readapt and learn like, hey, when this deck was around, it was really good against Hammer. It was really good against Murktide. It was really good against Scam. Bad against Creativity, but 3 of the 4 probably most popular decks in Modern right now, this deck was good against. It's kind of back. Let's experiment with it again. And we've seen it do really well. It won the Mana Traders, I believe, won the Modern 20K. If not, put it like 2 or 3 players in the top 8. So this deck is sort of back in a real way, and there's just like a lot of different things you can do with it in Modern. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, Abe. I could obviously talk about it a bunch, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that my only thought is that I think that we all really missed on how good Elshorn was in Modern specifically, because you just don't think of like how hard it is to kill. And we talked about this with Murktide Regent with how it was so good because it was hard to kill a 7 toughness creature. But then the people were like, "Oh, you can just Solitude a 7 toughness creature. Who cares?
Yeah,
we'll just play Solitude decks." But like, what happens when the 7 toughness creature is also a Torpor Orb?
Yeah,
and that's like really, that's really kind of swung it wide open. And just Torpor Orb is an effect of like your opponent's stuff doesn't do things. A lot of Modern decks are trying to do things, and so when your stuff doesn't do things, it's a lot worse, you know?
Yeah, it's really true. And then normally your Elishnorn decks do things, which is extra crazy.
Yeah. Like the good thing about your cards, like when you 2-for-1 yourself on a Solitude, if you're 2-for-2ing, it's a lot better. It's like you're drawing an extra card, kind of.
Yeah.
It's making the exchange even instead of you going down. And then when you turn a witness back 2 things, it just goes big mode. That's all I'm going to say about it.
Yeah, no, I think, the craziest part to me about playing this is that, Emrakul was a card that players played to sort of one-up each other in the mirrors in the past and sort of, have game against control deck, have a little bit of game versus Murktide, a little bit of game versus Amulet. And Elishnorn is good in all of those spots except for the Murktide matchup. It's sort of the one spot where you don't have that overlap. But it is so much better when it's in play than Emrakul kind of ever was, because Emrakul could get solituded, which was a big portion of the mirrors. You would just like hold solitudes for a long time, and then eventually Leyline Binding when that came out too, but you would just hold those cards, and then you would be, you would get like 4 or 5 for 1, but like your deck was so good at recouping cards that if they weren't already like at parity or ahead, you could overcome and beat that. I've beaten many Emrakuls. In fact, I beat one this past weekend at the SCG, my opponent doing it against me, because I had Elishnorn. And the moment I stuck Elishnorn, all of their cards immediately turned off, and players just I'm just gonna say, like, I think the Risen Reef builds are totally wash as long as the deck's popular. Like, if other people are playing the deck against you, your card advantage card cannot be Risen Reef. I don't care that it doubles up with the Elishnorn. You're too weak at answering Elishnorn, and that's why like my 4-color deck like went up and added the Black Triumph finally, and like plays all these verdicts and plays multiple Elishnorns. It's because it's so strong and so hard for so many decks to answer. So I think that card really has a big future, and eventually I think we could go back to Risen Reef Elishnorn decks, but right now when it's sort of the hotness and everyone's playing, you're playing the mirror like 1.5 times a league/tournament, I think it's just unacceptable to be on Risen Reef.
Yeah, I think that something that was often lost in the whole like Emrakul thing was that, I mean, the real value of Emrakul was that you would get to like shred your opponent's hand, right? You get to make them spend all the resources for bad exchanges. But that only mattered because it then allowed you, instead of playing this endless grind game of profitable exchanges for each other where you're just like slogging, your opponent can't keep up in the slog. But Elishnorn does all of that play dynamic that you accomplish with an Emrakul just by existing, because you're going to get ahead on every exchange and your opponent's going to not be able to get in on any exchanges.
Yep.
So, I think that's definitely crazy.
Yeah. I'll say this before we move off it. Maybe Unholy Heat Traverse stuff's got to come back in 4-color so you can, try and answer Elishnorns. And actually, like, it isn't a good look, but double Unholy Heating, or like Unholy Heating with a Wrenn and 6 isn't the worst way to answer one of these things. So that might be, sort of the future, move away from Eldon Recall stuff. I'm sure I'll have plenty of time to talk about that in other areas in the future, so I'm not going to waste y'all's time with that. I do want to talk a bit about 4-color creativity / 5-color creativity, because I do think it benefits a lot from the 4-color color deck rising up in popularity. That was a matchup that when the creativity deck first broke onto Modern, that is why it broke on, right? It was a deck that was preying on the 4-color decks. And as the 4-color decks have gotten smaller, can actually see their hate cards now more. It's still a little bit closer, but that 4-color creativity deck also got a bunch of big upgrades to cards like Leyline Binding recently. In fact, some creativity players, Abe, have adopted Elesh Norn as one of their things that they can cascade into out of their sideboard, and just being like, this is what I do in the mirrors or whatever, in other matchups too. So it is a very good deck. It is like, I'm of the opinion that like Fair Breach, Hammer, Normal Breach, Creativity, Scam are like the top 5 decks, and I have Murktide like number 6 and 4-color at like maybe 6B. That's like where I'm sort of at on things, but
yeah, that sounds about how I feel about the format too. And I think that, one of the reasons that Creativity is in that upper echelon is that, and there's something we talked about with just the Urza Saga's decks in general and why they were so good against the Murktide decks, and when Murktide was like deck A, and why they started to rise prominence, is that it was really about setting up positions where you would force your opponent to have to expend all their mana on one turn, and then you would untap and punish them. Right, that was the dynamic, and Urza Saga really played well into that. It does it in Hammer, it did it in the early Breach decks, the combo Breach decks, and it was really about pinching them on a single turn. So that meant that Creativity, as a deck that gets to play with its mana open a lot, is really appealing. It gets to fight over those early turns that are so pivotal, where the decks that are trying to like leverage their early pressure into something unfair, it gets to leverage its early interaction into doing something unfair, where it gets to leave its mana up, just hit some land drops, maybe take a turn to cast a Wrenn and 6, but that's acceptable. And then, have the opportunity to go over the top of you by, just putting some Archons into play, and that being better than what you can deal with. So I think that dynamic continues to be good, and decks that are a little bit clunky in the way that they have to interact in the early game, like 4-color, that seek to kind of make it out of the early game into doing more powerful things, rather than be able to kind of get position early. 4-color Creativity is just in that sweet spot, and while it does have its bit of issues with like the rise of more Blood Moons, and decks like Scam can be really tough for that reason, and there are ways to beat it. I think it's really benefited the most from the general play patterns, and I think the kind of new players of the format benefit them a bit as well, to increase that positioning. I mean, we saw in the in that Super, I believe that 3 of the top 4 were Creativity decks. So, like Creativity is definitely an archetype that, if you're someone who's not really about the Ragavan life, but you still want to operate in that space of playing something a little bit unfair, a little bit, or maybe you're not an Elesh Norn truther, and you want to Archon people, kind of a combo-y person. That deck is really, really good for that, and is still absolutely a contender. And there's tons of ways to build it too. It's a deck that has had a ton of different builds succeed on Magic Online from a bunch of different players that you can look into if you really want to get into the weeds about that. I know I've been working with someone in coaching on that, and the deck is just really, really interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of play and a lot of different ways you can take the deck and build your deck. So I big agree on those sort of things. I feel like that covers a lot of Modern. Modern's one of those formats where we could spend, like, we could really start going wider and wider with our fisheye lens and, talk about a lot of decks. But I think for the sake of getting you ready for RCQ season and that sort of thing, with this sort of lead time, talking about this sort of top decks now, they are probably not going to change too much unless March of the Machines, it's one machine, changes things drastically, so maybe battles are just totally game-changing, whatever. But for the most part, these should be really safe. And I kind of went in this on Abe. If you had to suggest, like 2 decks for people, if someone's sort of, wanting to think about, start working towards an RCQ season deck and want to start saving money, we're sort of buying the pieces now, what might be the 2-ish things that you're thinking about that you think?
I would say if you're brand new to getting into Modern, you really want to just make one set of purchases and really like ride it out, I would say just getting into the Murktide deck and the overlapping stuff for the Fair Breach deck, and just kind of understanding the two, pivoting between the two based on what people are playing, really just learning those things. You'll be playing a lot of the same core things really learning the same core muscles of like, okay, how is it that I'm going to play these Ragavan games versus the DRC games versus, how am I playing with counter magic or the removal? A lot of your games are going to look the same. It's going to be really transferable between the two decks, and you're going to be able to do that also to not a low cost. It's hard because Modern is a difficult investment, but a lot of your most expensive pillars you're going to be playing in both decks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I basically agree. I think that I would say whichever one of the fair decks, either Murktide or Breach, sounds most appealing to you, it's really hard to go wrong with either of those. And so I would pull the trigger on whichever one you think you're going to enjoy the most. And then I would pick up probably the creativity cards. I think that gives you two different styles of decks. So if things aren't really going super well locally, you're going to have something to pivot. Like Abe mentioned, it's going to be expensive no matter what, but some of the lands and stuff transfer between those decks, and some of the spells do as well. So you're going to save yourself a little bit of money there. You're going to have to be a little bit expensive because mana bases are awkward, but the creativity decks are really strong, and they cover different aspects of the metagame, and it sort of gives you a wide array of decks that you can play for each weekend. I'm sure Spencer would be pro creativity and Murktide. I know those are the two decks he loves, but I don't know what he would give the listeners. So, listeners, if you're watching on YouTube, comment below, what do you think Spencer's two decks would be? Abe, do you want to take your shot in the dark? Do you think it would be creativity Murktide?
I think creativity Murktide is a good bet. I think that Spencer might he might throw a little bit of curveball and go creativity hammer.
I could see that too.
Because hammer is, especially if you're going to get into two decks, hammer is on the lower end of a Modern deck right now, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's only like $600.
Yeah, and you could play mono white hammer and not worry about the fetch lands, or just get some canopy lands. Your Urza Saga is the expensive cards. That's a good card to own. Stoneforge Mystics are a little bit expensive. Also not a terrible card to own. But a lot of your pieces, your core, is Ornithopters.
Yeah.
Colossus Hammers. You got a core outfitter in there. You don't even know when that card was printed. Who needs to?
Yeah. Easy. I like it. By the way, I'll just say this real quick. I know there's always a lot of tension. I don't know if you have this, Abe, where some people talk to me in coaching about like, oh, do you think Ragavan's going to make, like, it's expensive. It's an expensive card. I'm of the opinion Ragavan is not going anywhere for like at least 5 years, especially with reprints, like we saw in March of the Machine. It is in a new booster fund. I think you are good to go on Ragavans. I personally, when it first came out, got the fancy Ragavans. I love them. They were like $10 more at the time. Totally worth it. I fully endorse, if you're going to be a Ragavaner and that seems like something you enjoy, pull the trigger on it. They're going to pay themselves off.
Yeah, I would say that Ragavan is definitely a safe card to invest in if you want to own some cards to play with, because it definitely feels the kind of card where Wizards is betting on it being a pillar. It's betting on it forcing people to care about the early turns of the game, and being able to remove creatures and things like that in a way that doesn't necessarily do it in an unfair way. Like when you're playing a Ragavan deck, you're doing something kind of fair. You're attacking people. You're getting on the battlefield. You're getting into combat, and they love that. So love your Ragavans. Get them well loved if someone's not loving their Ragavans, and you'll be happy for a long time.
Yep. That's going to do it for this week's main topic. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We're going to move on to our Patreon question of the week. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. The way to support the show. The show will always be free, but if you go there, you get access to the Discord. You can talk to us and others like-minded Magic players. There's always some conversation going on there. You also get to ask a question each week on the show. You get to ask one and we pick one to talk about. We don't answer every question sent in. But this week we got a question from a listener asking about what we thought about the RC from Japan over the past weekend. Are there any sort of standard decks that jumped out to us? So Abe, did you see anything from the RC in Japan that really jumped out to you that you were sort of looking at, interested in?
Yeah, so this is a deck that I know a lot of people have talked about, at least in my circles, as soon as they saw it as being a really, really cool deck. But the Selesnya toxic aggro deck that Ray Sato played at the Japanese RC, that deck is it took a lot of things that I was thinking about leveraging that I didn't have time to really get into and exploring, and put them into practice. Something that really stood out to me when Mono Red when Yeoman 5, shout out to him, got second place in a standard challenge the other week, was that he was talking about how really the deck leveraged action economy, is how I described it, but really just the efficiency, the ability to play a bunch of cheap cards that interact with the game, and interact with the board so that they can get ahead and kind of snowball the game away from decks that are being a little too slow, caught up in a little bit of an arms race with each other, being a little clunky. It was really punishing that. And this green-white deck, which its curve tops out at 3. I just want that. Like, it's really just 1 and 2 drops, and then like Annex Sentry and Bloated Contaminator as the top end, and that's it. The deck is really, really lean, and because of that, it gets to leverage that same effect of being super low to the ground, interacting really well, taking a bunch of favorable things, but it's doing it in a way that is better against other people doing the same kind of thing with the mono red cards, right? So if you're trying to just attack a bunch, you're going to have a hard time if my deck is entirely putting bodies into play. And we've talked about it before on the show where creatures have a really low fail rate, and this deck plays a lot of creatures that are just a little, when they're played together, they're just a little bit better than the mana you're spending into them. And the decks that are, you know, stumbling because of their mana bases, or you know, decks that are trying to get under you, you're knocking room to get under you, and you're actually punishing them for stumbling. So I really thought the deck was interesting. It's kind of become a front runner for me to explore for the RC as well.
Yeah. It's also very cheap. Yeah, I know we can talk about price and everything. It is just like an all v1 block constructed deck for the most part. But yeah, I think the deck is really good. Also, if you're interested in listening to Yeoman talk about the mono red deck more, he did an episode on Mythic Cast with Spencer and Michaela. That's on the network there, so you want to check out Mythic Cast. Their newest episode had Yeoman. Yeah, I really like the green-white deck as well. I think Skrelv's Hive in particular is a really strong card when lined up against Grixis, and just like they cannot really beat it unless they sort of have an early start that sort of curves out on you, and then they sort of catch up with some card, or like have, you know, just sort of the stone cold nuts the whole time, you know, and just like have it all. So I think Skrelv's Hive is a card that's really well positioned right now. I really like that deck. I'm really glad we got to talk about it. I think it's really good. The one that jumped out to me is one that I think Spencer mentioned in the show 2 weeks ago, and we talked about a little bit, the one where I first came back, but Mono Blue Tempo, I think that deck has always been pretty good. We saw Natoya, I believe is how you say his last name, at the RC in Japan get third place with this. Well, I'm not in love with sort of Delver of Secrets in this deck still. I think this general like idea of playing the mono blue cards, leaning on things like Negate now instead of Spell Pierce in high numbers, you know, even having like a Blue Sense Twilight in your main deck, really just trading cards effectively with Make Disappear, and what is the Scatter Ray is the new mana leak for creatures and vehicles. But yeah, this deck is, I think, really good, and just Flow of Knowledge gives you such a strong refuel card that you can just sort of overpower people. So I really like the looks of this sort of deck. And honestly, it's called Tempo, but really it plays out like a mid-rangey deck, especially if you cut your Delvers for Tolarian Terrors. If you do that swap, and I've played this deck a fair bit since then, it actually sort of plays out like you just sort of trade cards with your opponent, and then you stick like, you know, one thing, and then you turn to a Tempo deck. But you're not really trying to go under them in a real way. You're just sort of trading off, and then your Shieldred that was left on the battlefield is just, you know, a Haughty or a Tolarian Terror. You know, you just clear the way and do your thing. So I really like this deck. I think it is pretty well positioned, and, you know, it's something that I think is a real play on the RC, and players have discounted it because they think that, you know, Delver is something they can very easily answer as Grixis. And while that's sort of true with some draws, especially if players play things like Spell Pierce, it can be actually really hard to sort of answer all these things early and not get run over. So I think this deck is really great. I'm really excited, and it's one of my early front runners for the RC. So
yeah, my experience playing against this deck has been like, it usually goes in two phases. Like, oh wow, they're playing mono blue, easy win, and then like one of two things happens. Either I get a little scared because I like need to draw that removal spell for the Delver of Secrets and like force it through and find the window, and I do. Or my opponent casts Flow of Knowledge once, and I'm like, ooh, that's pretty bad. They just like drew 6 cards and discarded 2 islands they didn't need. And then they cast the second Flow of Knowledge. They drew off the first Flow of Knowledge. I'm like, I am gonna die now. So yeah, I think that I definitely think this is a pretty safe pick in terms of decks that are like gonna be well positioned. I think, like you were talking about, the threat package can be played with a bit. I could see Delver being a little bit better if you're expecting like more of the white mid-range decks, or like the Atraxa decks, things that are a little bit slower in playing to the board and where you need your mana a lot more, like definitely for the Reanimator decks, where you want to make sure you're always leaving out multiple pieces to counter magic. I can see wanting to get the Delver down early, but just in general, being able to play all of those things, being able to play a deck full of counter magic when that's like one of the best answers to these Reanimator decks, playing something that, has a game plan that punishes kind of the clunkiness of some of the mid-range decks, and also just getting to play a card that says draw 8 or whatever it is never a bad place to be.
Yep. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Constructive Criticism. If you want to find me, you can head on over to twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can head over to Twitter @MasonEClark. You can find me each and every week on Card Kingdom. This week I wrote about more standard leading to the RC, so if you're looking for standard content and prep there, we'll have that. We're also going to have a standard episode, I believe, next week as well, so get excited for that. We're going to go over some of all these RC results, talk about things, get you all ready for the United States RC and the RC after that. I can't remember which one. I think we're second to last this time. Regardless, you can check out all that sort of stuff, and if you're interested in coaching, feel free to reach out to me via my email, masoneclark@gmail.com, my Twitter DMs, or I also have a Patreon that has a message function. You can get me there if you don't have one of those things. Abe, where can people find you?
You can find me over at twitter.com/morenothings. I am still offering coaching. I still have probably 1 or 2 more slots available for people. If you want to get in on that, you can either send me a DM on Twitter, or you can send me an email at morenothings@gmail.com. Really short and sweet there. Just really a Twitter guy. So
nice. That will do it for this week's episode. We'll see y'all next week for another episode of CCMTG.